Documents from them explaining in insane levels of detail what is happening in our audiovisual industry. We don't pay enough attention to these numbers. They're very important. We can learn a lot from them. It seems sometimes when you're looking at these documents that they're remote from your day-to-day work. But no, they're really not. They're the essential information that we must have and must get used to having if we're to do our work. Also somebody from a very nice office. Guillaume Prieur works for the SACD, the French Audiovisual Collecting Society, which has, how would you describe it? It's a mansion? Would that be the correct description? A very, very nice building in Rue Balou in Paris, where Guillaume works with his colleagues. Doing extraordinary work, collecting lots of money and giving it to writers and directors, which is something I completely approve of. It's very good. Long may you continue to give people money. And what we will have today is a presentation from Ellen, a presentation from Christian. And essentially, Ellen is going to concentrate on the American market, so the 350 million people who live in America and the extraordinary television and feature films that they produce, which dominate our screens across Europe and across the world. Ellen will be also able to give us some very interesting information on what writers in America are paid and how those payments are calculated for the use of their work online, which is fascinating for Europeans because the vast majority of European writers and directors are not paid at all for the use of their work online. So I find that particularly interesting. And Christian will give a parallel description of the streaming video on demand environment in Europe. And I think it's very interesting to have a comparison of those two marketplaces. The American marketplace of 350 million people, the European marketplace of 500 million people. There's something very interesting to look at the two together. And then Guillaume has very kindly agreed to help us to try to interpret the results, to have a conversation about the results, and as much as possible at that point, this is how you demonstrate your craziness. I would like you to have as much of a conversation as we possibly can at that point, to ask questions so that you can understand what the numbers actually say. It would be okay to distribute the PowerPoint presentations afterwards. So if any of you want them, they will be available to you, of course. You will need them because it will take hours to understand them. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Ellen if she'd do her presentation. Thanks, Ellen.
So I really can't think of a more fitting place to have a PowerPoint presentation about numbers than a black box on -3. So it's perfect set location here. So I wanted to start with like a brief history looking at the development of the SVOD market, which has occurred in like a relatively short amount of time. The relevant history really goes back about 11 years and starts in 2007 when Netflix, which was a DVD by mail service, launched a streaming video offering. And it was in that same year that the members of my guild, the Writers Guild of America West and East, went on strike for 100 days to secure their jurisdiction over what we unironically termed new media, and still call new media, and residual compensation for reuse of television and films online. That happened, and then it was a few years of experimentation, and I would say the next big SVOD milestone happened in 2010 when Hulu, which is a domestic-only service, launched. And that was followed the next year by Amazon Prime, which is the free 2-day shipping service, adding video into its subscription offering. Really, the big game changer only happened 5 years ago, and that was in 2013 when Netflix launched some very high-budget original programming in House of Cards, Hemlock Grove, and Orange is the New Black. And really, House of Cards and Orange is the New Black, they broke out. They were very popular, and they demonstrated the viability of the SVOD market for original programming. In 2014, the WGA followed on the progress of 2007 by negotiating minimum compensation terms for the writing on the likes of Amazon and Netflix. Prior to that, while the work was covered, it was mostly negotiable what writers were paid. Then last year kind of was the next really big milestone in SVOD history, and that was when Netflix reached 100 million global subscribers. Also last year, the WGA negotiated improved residual compensation, so reuse royalties, for this SVOD programming, particularly on Netflix, and that included a residual payment for the first year of reuse and a payment for the foreign exploitation as Netflix has become this huge service around the world. And so we get to today where there are 168 million SVOD subscribers in the US. About 84 million homes have at least one SVOD subscription. We currently have 8 different services that are developing original series. And we've released about 78 original series through the third quarter of this year, and it's likely to reach about 100. So let me turn to the next slide and talk a little bit about the subscriber growth in the US. Right now, while there are about a half dozen SVOD services operating or developing, programming, only 3 have really broken out, and that's Netflix and Amazon and Hulu. Amazon, which as of last year had about 80 million subscribers in the US, their growth is really driven by people wanting their free 2-day shipping. But on a pure video offering, it's really the market is really Netflix, which is a major subject of this conference, as a huge service, and then about everything else. I mentioned that YouTube has a subscription service, and CBS, which is a broadcast network in the US, has a subscription service, and they only have about 1 to 2 million subscribers. For reference, I've included our basic cable subscribers, so this is your traditional pay TV market, and you can see there are still more cable subscribers than individual services, but that market is mature and it is losing subscribers primarily to the SVOD services. Moving on just to look at the SVOD or the content spending perspective. This market, SVOD, has grown up very quickly, mostly driven by Netflix. So just over the last 4 years, the content spending by Netflix and Amazon and the like has more than doubled and is now at levels comparable to our TV market segments. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that this isn't a perfect comparison because Netflix and Amazon, they are spending for a global market, whereas these, our broadcast networks, our basic cable, and our premium channels like HBO are really spending just for the US market. The other thing that's worth understanding is that right now, about 80% of spending by SVOD platforms is on acquisitions, so television series and movies. And right now, only about 20% on the actual original programming. So that's going to shift over time, but this market is still primarily a reuse market, and it's one that has been a boon to the traditional studios like Disney and Fox and the likes, and has not covered in this presentation, but driven peak profitability in the entertainment industry in the US because there's these new outlets. So moving on to talk about original series. So this chart looks at the covered, the Writers Guild covered dramatic series. So these are your comedies and dramas and the growth of this market. I mentioned it started in 2013 with House of Cards, and now has grown to almost 100 series in the last season, and certainly will be over 100 series in this coming season. Netflix, again, is about half of this, so they really are driving this market. Now, if we look in comparison to television, so this is your broadcast networks, your basic cable networks, and the like, SVOD is still a small fraction, so it's about 25% of total series programming that our members work on. Shifting from the market view to how writers in the US are paid for writing on SVOD programming, I'll start with the initial compensation, or the script fee. And I would say this is guided by two basic principles, how writers are paid on SVOD platforms. The first is the budget. So basically, the budget determines what you're paid on any SVOD service. So for example, if you write a half-hour episode and it costs at least $1.3 million per episode on any SVOD service, you're paid at least like you're writing on a basic cable network. And I should mention, below that budget, compensation terms are still negotiable. But for the most part, the overwhelming majority of programming on Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, and these other services are above these budget breaks. The second factor is subscribers. So for larger services, ones that have 20 million or more subscribers, there is a higher script fee for higher budget programming. So for a 1-hour drama on Netflix with a budget of at least $3.8 million, this would be something like Stranger Things. Those writers are paid script fees like broadcast television or a premium network like HBO. And these are currently the highest. Do you want to ask a question? I'm getting to it. This is the setup. So the numbers, okay? So this slide gives you, this is the current script fee for SVOD, half-hour and 1-hour programming based on subscribers and budgets. So you can see if you have 20 million or more subscribers. I mean, you can take pictures. You can also, I will happily email this to you if you want. You can have two possible tiers, and so one is this basic cable tier where for like a half-hour program you'd be paid about $15,000, and if it's a higher budget it's about $26,500. The other thing in the US, writers on television series are typically hired to work together in a writing room, and so in addition to the script fee, they are also paid for the weeks that they work. And so the bottom is the weekly compensation. And these are the same minimums that apply to weekly compensation for all of television. So essentially what we've established here is that working for an SVOD service in the US is like working in television. And we have members moving back and forth all the time, and sort of what we've negotiated makes it okay to do that. So moving on to residuals, here things get a little bit more complicated and less understandable, so bear with me just for a few slides. There's a few different factors that determine what residuals are for the reuse. This is of original programming. So if a television show goes to Netflix, it's actually very simple. The writer just gets 1.2% of whatever the company who is licensing it gets. So this is all covering, your Stranger Things and House of Cards and that sort of programming, how they're paid. So the first factor in kind of determining residual compensation is the number of subscribers. And so this helps you accommodate like a wide range of services where we have services that have 1 million subscribers or Netflix with 56 million currently. And it follows a principle that as these services grow, the residual compensation should increase and writers should be better paid. The second is that writers received a fixed annual payment for the continued on-demand availability of their programming. So under the Writers Guild agreement in markets like television, the script fee typically covers one airing. So you pay the script fee, you can broadcast the programming, but then any subsequent usage generates a residual payment for the writer. But in SVOD, what's a run when the programming is always available? What we've settled on is that the script fee payment covers 90 days of availability on an SVOD platform. After that, you have to pay to continue to make it available. And then finally, there are separate payments for domestic and foreign SVOD usage. So this also follows the principle in television and other markets where the script fee gets you a domestic run, and if you want to license it for exhibition in Europe or anywhere else, the writer is paid a separate payment. So we're just replicating that concept here. So those are the principles, but how do you actually calculate the residual? This is really complicated. You have to sort of answer these three questions. So the first is, what subscriber tier does the service fall into? Currently there are 5, and it depends on depending on the size of the service, there's a discount for the residual, or in the case of larger services, you pay a premium. Second, what is the exhibition year? This table shows the % residual due in each year, and you can see it declines, and sort of as the content ages, it has less value. And then the third is there foreign usage? So if so, there's a foreign payment that is due that is essentially a % of the domestic payment. So I'm sure none of that made sense. So maybe we'll just walk through an actual example. So here's a 1-hour drama on Netflix. You have to start with a base amount that is set in our contract, and we call it a residual base, and here it's about $26,000. Because Netflix is in the highest tier, they have to pay a premium, which is 150%. And so then you get this applicable residual base of $38,000. So this becomes the amount that you take a % of to get the residual. We're saying in the first year of the exhibition, the residual percentage is 35%. So your domestic residual is $13,473. Because Netflix also is available around the world, they have to pay the foreign residual, which is 35% of the domestic residual. So then you get the foreign payment is $4,716 for a total in the first year of $18,189 for the writer of that. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Are these numbers for just one screenwriter, or are they need to be split between all screenwriters?
So it's for one episode. So sometimes there's a team, and so if you have a team of writers, they would split this, but it's just for the episode. So who's the credited writer? So for if a season of Stranger Things is 13 episodes, there'll be 13 of these payments in the first year to whoever are the credited writers. So sometimes there is a team, but a lot of times it's usually just an individual. Okay?
Sorry, just one thing. Could you ask the question one more time in the microphone because it will be recorded?
Ah,
That's why.
okay.
So I wanted to know if these residuals were for one screenwriter or for all the writing room, which is written on the show.
Yeah. And so just the concept is our residuals are by episode, so it's for the credited writer of the episode. And so here's another example I'll just run through, and this is a half-hour comedy on Amazon. So again, you start with that residual base, the subscriber tier, 20 to 45 million. You'll notice that earlier I said Amazon has 80 million subscribers, but they're in the 20 to 45 million subscriber range, and that's because many things are up for negotiation, and the companies that we negotiate with, I don't know, insist on discounting subscribers to a service like Amazon because they'll say, well, you know, many of them are just in it for the free shipping. So that we had to agree to. We didn't like, but anyways. So again, you do this, what's the applicable residual base? Here we're taking the second year where the domestic residual is 30%. To get about $4,000. The foreign residual is 35% of that, which is almost $1,500, and the total is $5,700, and it should say for the second year, so apologies for that. Finally, here's just a slide. This gives you a summary of your residuals over a 5-year period across the varying subscriber tier levels. One thing I didn't discuss, but you'll see here, is for services that have fewer than 1 million subscribers, they actually get to have the first year of reuse for free. There's no payment, so that's a discount. Yes? Oh.
You just gave an annual residual, but you talked about a 90-day brink and then renewal. So
Yeah.
how is that factoring in what?
So for the first year, they get 90 days, and then they have to make the payment that covers the first year. And then when the second year starts, then they make the second year payment. So it's basically like you get 90 days for free in this first 1-year period, and then a residual becomes due. And then on an annual basis. Right. For the first 90 days, you are just paid your script fee. So the $25,000 or whatever, you're paid that, and then obviously, as Glory was talking, like you write and the show doesn't come out for a while, and so you may wait 6 months for the show to air, and then once it airs, 90 days, and then the residual compensation is due.
Just to clarify, when you say base residual or residual base, that's the script fee. No, that's okay.
I know.
Sorry.
If only it were simple. It's close to it. It used to be the case, and our contract is like 600 pages now, and I would say it's really the companies that insist on making it more complicated. So we used to use the shorthand that it is the script fee that's kind of the base amount, but it's like slightly different now, just to make things more confusing and difficult to enforce. And so I'll just finish up and just say, and then you can ask a question. What I wanted to say is here, obviously there's a wide range of residual compensation. One of the things that we've done is for a service like Netflix, these amounts, so that would be the greater than 45 million, this residual compensation is now similar to what you can expect to make for television. So just looking at how shows from broadcast are actually reused and sold, these amounts match it. So that's been a very important thing for this guild. We call it parity. We want parity so that if writers move from this market to that market, they're not hurt economically. And what we did in our negotiations last year really helped get kind of Netflix into that world. And so as other services grow, those writers will be, similarly more at parity. So anyways, I don't know if you want to ask your question.
Yes, and maybe you will come to it, but I was wondering so do they get paid through the guild or directly from Netflix or through the producer, or who? How is it arranged?
For script fees, for your initial compensation, your weekly rates, you're usually paid directly. All residual compensation is paid to the guild, and then the guild we send green envelopes to our members so that they don't throw them out. Because if we sent them like other guild mail, they might just throw it out. So they know that they want. And so as David was mentioning, we have about 25 people in our residuals department, because it's a right that exists in perpetuity, and so there are things from 50 years ago that still receive residuals, and we have to send it out. Yes?
To continue on the question, is Netflix signatory to your minimum basic agreement and therefore pays directly, or do you negotiate this with producers?
So both. Netflix is a signatory to the Guild agreement because obviously when they started out, they picked up shows from Sony or Lionsgate or Disney, but they've realized that they want to produce their own programming, and so they have a signatory, which just adheres to our collective agreement. We just have one collective agreement. They have to pay like all the other companies. Great.
Come on, Robert.
Yeah, so how is the 1.2%, I mean, it's 1.2%, but what is it 1.2% of?
So it's the license fee. So say if you license a broadcast show, I don't know, The Big Bang Theory or something, for $1 million per episode to Netflix, the writer gets 1.2% of that $1 million. So if Netflix is producing for Netflix, it's these residuals. Right. So this is for the original programming that's available. For anything else that's coming from another market to Netflix, it's the percent of license fee.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so as you were saying, Netflix is going global. I'm a scriptwriter from Egypt, and I might be pitching something to Netflix that would be in English. How can I be under this umbrella? Do I have to be American? Do I have to be a part of the guild?
You don't have to be American. Typically, the companies will try and say that if you are not, if you don't reside in the United States, that our jurisdiction doesn't cover it, but you can negotiate what we call overscale jurisdiction. So if you want to come talk to me, I can give you my card. But basically what you have to do is you have to work for a company that signs onto our agreement. And you know, they are reluctant to do that in some cases. There are a lot of international companies that do hire WGA members, but they tend to want to try and avoid it when they can. But we do cover, you know, programming around the world. Somebody who is working on an Indian series for Netflix had contacted us about how they might, you know, get under this agreement. So it's possible. So if you want to come talk to me, I can.
Thank you.
For you, yeah. I'm done.
You done?
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think it's safe to say that non-American guilds have some negotiating to do. Yeah. And here's Christian Grece from the European Audiovisual Observatory with the European figures.
Thank you, David, and thanks for having me. So, I'm going to give you the main figures on the European Union market for SVOD and VOD services, if it works. No. So first, the main numbers, and just to place the VOD market, which is clearly growing the fastest, but in the overall audiovisual market, it's still quite small. I give you the main numbers. Then a short focus on the SVOD market. So we will see the two main players dominate the European market. And finally, our main figures for TV fiction and feature film production in the European Union. So, there's clearly an explosive market growth on the VOD segment, paid VOD services, subscription VOD, but also transactional VOD. It's driven mainly by the launch of new services, direct-to-consumer models by traditional players, the expansion of international groups, players such as Netflix or Amazon, and Disney, HBO into the European market. Of course, VOD has encountered rapid consumer adoption and has also changed how consumers want to access their content. And finally, with the widespread of broadband, over-the-top distribution of content, of films, of TV series is becoming mainstream. Now we are in a situation where there's an abundance of content, but a scarcity of consumer attention. 20 years, 30 years ago, it was the inverse. Content was controlled. Now content, films, TV series, you can find them almost everywhere. And the shift is also in consumer behavior. They now favor more access to content through subscription services, not only in audiovisual content, but also in music, more and more in video games, over ownership. Before people bought DVDs or Blu-rays or VHS, now they just want to have access to it. But as I said before, the VOD market is clearly growing fast, but still quite small. The main figures, here you can see the explosive growth of SVOD, which was multiplied by 10 in just 5 years, from 360 million to over 3.6 billion euros in 2017. And transactional video on demand has also grown, but at a much smaller rate. The all-you-can-eat menu offered by SVOD service is clearly convincing consumers. But the European Union market, audiovisual market, generated 111 billion euros, and paid VOD service only represent in 2016 at least 3%. Now it's maybe around 4 to 5%. The main markets are clearly still pay TV, advertising, television, or public funding of the audiovisual ecosystem. But in the future, it's clear where the market is going. Whereas the other markets stagnate, grows little or decrease, VOD is growing fast and faster. Is growing fast as penetration and consumer usages change. Now a little focus on SVOD. As I've said before, this rapid consumer, this changing consumer expectation has now launched a rush towards the launch of direct-to-consumer models by traditional media players in order to be able to compete in the future. And this in turn, now in Europe we have over 180 different SVOD services in the 28 member states, but only 2 players dominate the market, owning 80% of SVOD subscribers and 74% of revenues. And another turn is that high-end premium content, TV series or films are becoming increasingly more expensive. And as these players can amortize this content, their investments into many markets, European players, which only operate on the national market or a handful of markets, have more and more difficulties to compete with them. Therefore, we see now alliances between private, public, television channels, alliances throughout countries. Broadcasters, pay TV players are getting together in order to increase their size and also their investments. So, just to give you an overlook, 54 million SVOD subscribers in the European Union in 2017, 80% are owned by Netflix and Amazon. And here you see the importance in OTT, on the OTT market of size. If you're not operating in multiple countries, you're only getting a smaller part of the revenue pie. And of course, this translates also in the dominance of revenues. 74% of all SVOD revenues are taken by these 2 players. Again, national players only operating on their national market or in a handful of countries are facing more and more difficulties to effectively compete on this new market segment. And looking now at the individual market, the biggest markets are, of course, those generating more revenues. We can see in Western Europe, the Nordic countries, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, adoption was fast, and these markets already generate a lot of revenue. In Central Eastern Europe, it's not already the case. But when we look at penetration, we see that only in 2 countries, more than 50% of households subscribe at least to one SVOD service. So in the future, there's clearly a big room for growth, and I think that the market will go on the SVOD route, on the direct-to-consumer model. Disney is now also expanding in Europe, will launch a service. Comcast has bought Sky for this limit, access to European consumers through OTT services. So there's clearly room for growth. We will see who will own these new subscribers. And also, more and more consumers are subscribing to more than one service. It's called SVOD stacking, and globally, the average is that people are subscribing to 2 services. So not a much room. I think for generalistic services like Netflix or Amazon, they're going to choose one of these, and maybe they're a big national player. But there's room for niche services. Specialized content. If you can touch people on their interest, then you can distribute content to them and monetize it. And finally, in the future, everything will be distributed over the internet. It will be a platform-agnostic future. Over the top is clearly the route to go, and this for all broadcasters or media players. And now the part which is maybe more relevant for you, content investments. First, the average revenue per consumer, per user, is much less in direct-to-consumer models. Only 1/3 of revenues generated from, in Western Europe from the traditional pay TV model, the half in Central Eastern Europe. So traditional players are clearly facing problems with increased content costs to finance finance content in the future. And therefore, we are seeing more and more co-productions, alliances between players which before were clearly competitors. And content spent. Netflix, Amazon are already spending much more than any European broadcaster, be it pay TV, private or public, on content investment. And this will, of course, lead in the future with these new mega deals in the hundreds of millions euros for showrunners, for premium producers, will lead to difficulties for European players to be able to compete with them. And here are interesting figures on the upcoming TV shows by Netflix, for example. They just announced 257 new TV shows, clearly skewing towards comedy, science fiction, and drama. Amazon, Netflix, over 250 TV shows. Amazon, 100, more towards drama, science fiction. And then a traditional big player in launching new TV shows, HBO, around 67. 65. And here you can see also the difference. HBO has a drama, is specialized more in drama, and cannot invest as many in other genres like Netflix and Amazon do it. And finally, a new player, Apple, only a handful of shows where it's clearly skewing more towards crime and comedy shows. And now our figures on TV fiction production in Europe. So in Europe, we estimate that over 920 TV fiction titles are produced per year. The large majority of them are either TV films in 1 or 2 episodes, or what we call the premium TV shows, series between 3 and 13 episodes. But as you can see, the most hours are clearly generated by telenovelas, soap operas with more than 52 episodes per year. But when we look at the origin of these high-end TV shows, so 3 to 13 episodes, it's still the public sector which produces the most TV content, high-end TV content in Europe. And as you can see, SVOD is really marginal in the European production. Now things are going to increase surely a little bit with the new announced revision of the AVMS directive, 30% of quotas for this player. But still, in Europe, SVOD players are investing around 3-4% into TV titles. And to conclude, the release of feature film production, Europe, we estimate that over 1,600 feature films are released every year, increasing on a yearly basis, 100 feature fiction films, and over 500 documentaries. And clearly on the market, on the cinema market, we see it, there's a lot of competition for the audience, and it's getting harder and harder to capture the attention of the audience. And so the European feature films are really seeing their admissions decrease or stagnate. That was it for me. Thank you very much. And we have a lot of information on our website.
Okay, you got all that, yeah? You understand everything? That's an extraordinary amount of information in an area that we all know in our working lives that our industry is going to be radically altered by streaming video on demand, in particular OTT services. but at the same time, we don't quite know how or when. And all of this information, on the one hand, every writer that you meet in Europe only wants to know how they can work for Netflix, how they can get the gig. But the volume that Netflix is producing is actually, in Europe, very small compared to the total volume of production. It's still public service broadcasting. It's not a service which is changing who's making the product yet. So I think one question that's very interesting is, how much more can those services grow in terms of production? Are they going to keep at this level of production? Are they going to increase this amount of production? Do they arrive at a certain point where they're saying, okay, we're spending too much money on production, and they start cutting back the volume of production? But for me, it's not production that's the main question. It's how the subscriber base is going to alter public service broadcasting. How can public service broadcasting and even more private broadcasters survive in a marketplace where they're dependent on advertising, and this advertising is being taken from them by streaming video on demand? So I don't understand it. So that's why we asked Guillaume to come and explain it all for us and put it in context and make sense of it. SACD, as I understand, Guillaume, one small thing. You have actually negotiated with Netflix and done a deal with Netflix. So we want to know all of the details of your Netflix deal.
All of the details. It won't be possible because, as you know, when you sign an agreement with big American companies, you have a lot of articles about the secret of affairs, and so I will be forbidden. It will be forbidden for me to reveal a lot of details. So, thank you, David, for the invitation and also for the presentation of SACD at the beginning of the panel. Just to add one thing, because it's linked, in fact, with the actual problematics of all the authors can have. The SACD is a very old society, the oldest society of authors in the world, because it was founded in 1777, and it was founded one night during a dinner organized by Beaumarchais and other authors, because they were really fed up with the French comedy. We were exploited without their authorization and without giving them just a remuneration for the exploitation. So, in fact, it's also some problematic, very actual and very, very modern. And so this condition of creation gave us also a double nature, because on the one hand, of course, we negotiate agreements with broadcasters about the work whose authors are members of SACD. Now we are the author of SACD are nearly 60,000 people, and on the other hand, we have also another role and a mission a general mission to defend and to protect authors and rights, and more generally the cultural diversity. To come back to the presentation and maybe to tell you some general meanings about it, I think that in the presentation of Christian about the video market in Europe, I found two elements particularly silent. Particularly silent because they are almost even contradiction, because in fact today, the European video market is very small, and also you said it, David, to the volume of production compared to the audiovisual ecosystem. But nowadays, there is no debate on the audiovisual sector without placing in its heart the place and the role of digital platforms. And the two, it's a very fragmented market. In France now, I think that the last number of French Center of Cinema told us that there were about 70 services of VOD in France. It's a lot, but it's a very fragmented market, but also very concentrated. Christian, you said it, in Europe, Amazon and Netflix, it's about 80% of the market. But in fact, this is not as contradictory as that seems to be, because I think it's especially the sign that we live in Europe and also in France, profound disruption, in fact, in this moment, and essentially, I think three disruptions. The first one is a disruption in terms of borders. Until now, audiovisual, we were in a national landscape organized around national actors with national organization proposing programs for national public. Today, the world is globalized and allows the development of international actors who address agencies around the world and crossing national borders and regulations too. Second disruption, I think, it's also in financial terms, because we talk about the financing of creation by Netflix or Amazon. I think Netflix announced $7 billion and Amazon more than $4 billion invested in movies and series in this year. It's a lot. It's a lot more than we can know in our national level, in fact. And the third disruption, it's really important too. It's in terms of use by the public, because the use are now multiplied. Access to works and programs is at the request of the consumer, when he wants, where he wants, and on the screen he wants. While of part of our regulation in France, especially was born where there was only 5 channels, many rules that we know are today obsolete, in fact, and archaic. In this context, of course, the question of remuneration of authors, the financing of creation, and also the distribution of works is really crucial. On the remuneration of authors, I heard with a lot of interest what Helen said. The American example is very interesting, but also in the same time very specific, because the protections of the American writers and their collective agreements following our tracks are almost unique in the world, because when we have a look on the situation in Europe, in fact, the protections are really different. Sometimes they don't exist at all. And to take the situation in France, the protection is based in particular in collective management, which plays a powerful role, and today guarantees proportional remuneration to the author when their works are exploited and shown, because there is very few number of collective agreement between broadcaster, producer, and author. In fact, it's very few. Last year there were an important negotiation and also an agreement, but it was limited to the transparency. It's really important to have transparency, to have the information from producer for the exploitations of the work, but what is important is also the repartition of value. In Europe today, we speak a lot about value gap. There is also a value gap when authors don't see any money coming back, whereas their works are exploited. So it's really important. So what is SVOD is doing in this context to protect authors? We are signing, of course, agreements with traditional television channel. We ever did it, and we continue to do it. It's really simple, because in fact, in return for the possibility of using the works from our repertoire, for the work of SVOD's member, we receive in fact a percentage of the broadcaster turnover. But now we have also agreements with digital platforms. We have reached a satisfactory agreement with Netflix for 3 years now, and I think we are alone in Europe to have managed to have this kind of agreement. And it's really important, because now this agreement allows us to pay screenwriters and directors based on the availability and also the viewing of their works when it's in the Netflix catalog. We have also an agreement with YouTube since for 8 years now, and the next step for us is Amazon, of course, which with them we are in discussion, and also Facebook, but it's harder because they spend their time hiding for the moment and trying to protect themselves behind the status of host, of internet host, to pay nothing to the author. But the essential in this context is that the digital platform ensure fair remuneration for author. Today, I know that the situation in France is more positive than in many European countries, and this is why the regulation is so important. It's not only the strategy of broadcaster, of discussion we can have in France or everywhere, but what the Europe is have as a regulation to give the possibility to author to be really remunerated. That's why the ongoing discussions in Europe around the corrective directive is so important, because it's necessary that all European authors, in whatever country they are, benefit from this right to proportionate remuneration. This last month and even this last year, we have been mobilized a lot in SAA, which federates European Collective Management Society with the FSA too, and FERA to obtain this right. There was a big positive step last month in European Parliament, because an article has been introduced in the directive. It's Article -14. It's minus, but it's a plus for authors. You must remind of this. And this article recognizes the existence of this right to proportionate remuneration everywhere in Europe. But at this stage, the step of European Parliament is really important, but nothing is gained. And all those who want to support this idea and this right are very welcome, and there is also a petition online to support it, so you can find it really easily on internet, and you can sign it, because at the end it's in fact your right to be paid that are at stake in this directive. And the other issue is also the role of this digital platform on financing and visibility for European creation, because we really need to make this platform partners for European creation. So I just wanted to mention the recent adoption of the directive, named Directive AVMS, which would be very important, because that will change two important rules in the regulation of each state. The first one is now VOD service could have obligation to invest in national and European creation in the countries on the basis of the turnover of the country generated inside. But it's the liability of each state to determine such an obligation. Just to take the example of France, in France now it's already the case, but depending of the type of the VOD service, this obligation could represent more than 20% of the turnover of a service. So it's really important, and it's a really added value of this directive. And the second important change, and that will concern all the European countries. Platforms, digital platforms should have at least 30% of European works in their catalog. In France, in fact, already most of services are managed to have 30%, but in a lot of countries, like in Eastern Europe or in other countries, sometimes some studies have been made and showed that, for example, in some Netflix service or iTunes, you were only 10% and sometimes less of European creations. So it's really essential, in fact, because the disappearance of European work on this digital platform, which develop at very high speed, would be a disaster for the visibility of European creation. And we can be sure, in fact, that an European creation that would become invisible in the digital world would soon also have problems to be financed. To conclude, I think we are very lucky in Europe to have a lot of talent in the writers. We can create high quality works. This is a change, but I think it's also a new deal for traditional broadcaster, because now there will be in competition to attract the best talents. And today, the author who work for this big digital platform tell us that they find there a freedom of creation that they don't manage to find everywhere. So, provided that these new platforms offer contracts in accordance with the regulation of each country, it's also an important dimension. Their arrival, I think it's also the time for traditional broadcasters to rest the issue of their relation with author. And for sure, just to conclude definitely, David, the time is exciting.
Yeah, for sure. We don't have an awful lot of time, and I hope you have questions. Good. Can we, just before going further, can we just speculate on one thing? Maybe, Ellen, I ask you this. How big can Netflix get? Is it going to keep growing like this? Is there a top? Is there a place where it doesn't make sense to spend money the way they're spending?
Well,
are they a natural monopoly like a Google or a YouTube?
I don't think they're a natural monopoly because they're affordable for consumers. Now analysts say 300 million global subscribers is kind of where we might see Netflix get in the next 10 to 12 years, and that certainly seems possible. The spending right now, our speculation is, Netflix started out making deals with all the traditional media companies in the U.S. and getting all the TV shows, and that really boosted the bottom lines of the Disneys and the Foxes and the Warner Brothers and the NBCs of the world. And then those companies realized that they licensed the shows too cheaply. And really help Netflix grow and become a competitor instead of, this repository for their content. And so they're all in the process of pulling that back and developing their own service. Disney's going to have a service. Now Comcast NBCU has bought Sky. They're going to have a global service. And so Netflix has this issue where all of this content that they've licensed is going to cycle off their service. So they have to spend, and our speculation is they're going to spend the next 5 to 10 years trying to build the original library that HBO has built for 3 decades. They're just trying to do it in a really compressed time. So at some point, they're spending, and projections already have it leveling off. It's just going to shift. So if it's 80-20 now, skewed to acquisitions, it's going to, get to 50% or more in originals, but probably the total spending is going to level off a little bit.
And I think that you're completely right, Guillaume, in the European context to concentrate on regulation. And the regulation which is coming, the broadcasting regulation and the copyright directive, go in very much the right direction. But they come flat against Netflix's policy of total secrecy. We are putting in a transparency obligation in the directive, and we want to take this transparency obligation to Netflix, who will not obey. They will not tell you any information. Do you think that this is something that we can break, that we can persuade Netflix that they have to start telling us? You have the same thing. They don't tell you anything, right?
Right, and that's why we have a flat, because there's no additional revenue and how popular, but I think it'll eventually be solved in the U.S. by a company called Nielsen that does television ratings. They're going to have to develop an outside model for rating content, but anyways.
Which is a question for the observatory as well. How to measure Netflix when you don't know, when they won't give you the information?
Well, we have some estimates of Netflix subscriber base, and I think what friends did is to tax them proportionally to their generated revenue, which you can always estimate if they don't give it to you.
Questions? Can I start with this one, then go to you? I know you were first, but if it's okay.
Although this doesn't affect me personally, but do you think, Ellen, that you gave away the older rights too cheaply? Because, for example, Star Trek on Netflix is running and running. It's over 50 years old. And according to your chart, it's worth 1.3% of a new show, or even less than that, although the show is not worse. So there are many writers here who've got volumes of great shows 30 years back, 20 years back, who hope for residuals, that are worth nothing if Netflix gets their way. Or not much compared to new content, let's say it that way.
Are you asking if the revenue-based residual for the TV shows, if I think that's too cheap, or what are you...
Well, the thing is they're proven content, they're proven programs and loved brands. How could it be that the WGA West, that apparently are usually quite knuckle-headed and quite strong-armed, pawned that off, it feels to me. Because if you have a hit show and that runs for 30 years or 40 years or 50 years or only 10 years, how can it be this much less worth, although it's proven to be working? And Fuller House is now produced because of Full House on Netflix, for example. How could you pawn off rights that are proven to be valuable? Not you personally, sorry, but...
Well, I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding. I mean, do I wish the residual percentage was higher? Yes, of course. As you know, everything is a negotiation, and it's a power accommodation. And, there are long-standing residual formulas, and it can be hard to increase them. So, for instance, we'd love it to be 2%, and that would be a big difference. But when it comes down to you're on strike, and what gains are you going to make, and how much you're going to get the companies to give? Because I'll say, they have to pay, let's say in that instance, 1.2% to the writer, they have to pay 1.2% to the director, and then they have to pay about 3 times that for the actors. So. Of course, we think it's far too generous, but it's what the guilds are able to negotiate. And then, I mean, for writers and particularly creators of those shows, those people are profit participants on that programming, and so they can expect to receive themselves through their own individual negotiations 10% of profits or that sort of thing. And so, we negotiate a minimum collective bargaining agreement, and our members have the ability to negotiate overscale compensation that reflects the different values that they provide. So we set the floor, and then there are improvements above it. But sure, I always wish there was more.
This is a question for Guillaume. Thank you for your, all of you, by the way, thanks. I'm with the Dutch Writers Guild, along with these 2 ladies, and I wouldn't even begin to tell you the problems we're facing, the obstacles we're facing in terms of, reaching collective agreements. For one, we don't even have the legal the legal bedding to do that. But we're trying, and we're all volunteers. And the question I have for you, Guillaume, is right now Netflix is, one of their main offices is in Amsterdam, as I'm sure you know. And they're starting to curate Dutch content very slowly, very carefully. But we as writers, of course, would want to jump into that opportunity and start creating content with Netflix. The question I have is the SAD agreement that you concluded with Netflix, is it available to us as a guild so we can look at it and take example from it? And we won't be, at a short notice, we won't be able to come to similar agreements with Netflix, but at least we might be able to reference it as a standard that we could use. And the same goes to you, Ellen. Can we access the agreement as an example to just go from? That would already be a good start,
Thank you for the question with this continuity with David said for the question of transparency, in fact, and it's really a question and an important issue because in France, I think now we are the only one person we can know the turnover of Netflix in France, the number of subscribers, and also all the views of each program and each works. So maybe we are not alone, because I'm thinking of that, because now Netflix must pay a tax to the French Center of Cinema. It's in a tax which based on this on their turnover in France. So maybe I think that the French authorities can rebuild the turnover of Netflix, but it's impossible for us, as I was saying at the beginning of the conference, to show or to explain a lot of things about this agreement. What can I say? That we have this agreement with Netflix for 3 years now. And that we take into account to make the repartition between also, on the one hand, the availability of the program on the Netflix catalog, but also we take into account the number of consumption of their works. So if you want, after we can stay in contact. But I can't give public information. But I'm really I totally agree with David, and I find it would be very important that Netflix be more transparent about all the professionals of audiovisual, and also about the producer, to give them information about the exploitation. But it's also a pity, because I think there was a big opportunity with the copyright directive to extend the obligation of transparency to platforms. But of course the lobbying of producers have been more concentrated to fight against the right for remuneration for the author, whereas they have the opportunity to ask to obtain a real transparency. It's really a pity.
Sorry.
When the platforms are producers, we can ask them as producers under the transparency obligation. So there will be some information. Yes,
if I understand you correctly, you're not allowed to share this information with other European guilds due to non-disclosure by Netflix, or no? Did I understand it wrong?
Maar hij mag niet. Part of the agreement with Netflix is that you cannot tell the information.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's a non-disclosure element of the SACD agreement with Netflix that they're not allowed to share it.
But we can help each other. I get it. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But our agreement is not confidential, and so all of that information is available, on our website if you can find it. So it's,
and understand it.
Yeah, but nothing is secret here. Yeah.
You want to see the Writers Guild of America minimum basic agreement. If you hit somebody with the minimum basic agreement, they would never get up again. Yeah. It's a big document. Suzine, you wanted to come in? Can we have the microphone? Thanks.
Yes, in Sweden we are discussing a lot about how to get some order in this Netflix matters, but I think that we have come to the solution that we have to lock in the rights, that we have to have the rights in collective management, otherwise we won't be able to make deals with Netflix. And that's the way, French, you're strong in that way. So that's why also that you have an agreement. But of course it's difficult, because all writers are very interested in working for Netflix, and you have to organize this in a way that it's not only Netflix, it's every platform that you have to. But the big problem is that you don't know their business model. I'm not able to see what kind of money that is inside these kind of business models. And that makes it differs from every negotiation that you are making otherwise, because then you know a lot about, if you talk to a producer, you know a lot about his business model. You can see the money in and you can see the money out, and you can understand what is a profit that is reasonable to demand for your members. But with Netflix, you don't know that. And that's, I mean, that must be a very big challenge. And I think if you got figures about these old programs that you mentioned, that if we had the viewers, if we know how much viewers that are looking at Star Trek, for example, then we would be able to discuss how much payment, more payment perhaps, some series should have compared to others. But we don't know. And then we are stuck with models that are more not so connected to royalty thinking that we are used to in our organizations, that look at the profit and see how much of that is able to get to our members. But this is not the way that you can negotiate. So that's more a comment I had on this, but I think it's rather difficult, and I think that Sweden, that is one of the countries that has a lot of these production going on. And we also, the question I want to come to is, what about the producers? Are they satisfied with the situation? Because in Sweden, I feel that many producers are a little bit reluctant at the moment. They feel that they also have a problem with these business models. And I wanted to know what is your experience about the producers?
You want to come on that one?
Yeah, just a quick answer. I'm not producer, but I think that producers are not very satisfied with the arrival of Netflix, because the method of producing or financing by Netflix is totally contrary to the French system. In France, in fact, for the audiovisual production, in fact, it's the broadcaster which bring majority of money to make the film, but after the producer keeps the rights. With Netflix, it's totally the contrary, because Netflix arrive, put the money, and after take all the right, and the independent producer don't see anything for the future. So they are not happy at all.
There has been some discussion, and I'm not sure about it, that at the European Union level, that writers and directors should get together with the producers' organizations to discuss this with the producers' organizations and see if there is a common platform that we can adopt. For myself, I feel slightly uncomfortable with the idea of negotiating with the producers on our side, but maybe it's something we have to do.
I'll just say in the U.S., I think a lot of producers have approached the idea of working with a Netflix and Amazon as they do get guaranteed profit. So oftentimes those agreements are 130% of the production budget. So a producer can go into making a Netflix show and know that they will make a profit off of one series. Now they give up the opportunity to have a big hit because they are licensing it to Netflix, but it's okay to sort of spread the risk across your production sort of portfolio, but they also realize the business model of Netflix is subscribers. It's to grow subscribers, and it's very hard to, attach any revenue to your individual show, because it's about it's about subscribers, and mostly what we're seeing is that contracts kind of adopt buyouts, like for traditional rights. So a profit participation definition says Netflix will pay me X amount of money because we'll value the DVD rights at $500,000 per episode, even though they'll never put it on DVD, and so I get some percent of that. But it's odd, but it exists in HBO. I mean, the whole thing, Netflix is not like the newest creator of this model of programming. HBO has done it for years, and so there are some models that exist.
So we're moving towards the end. Anybody else have an urgent question they want to ask us? Yes.
This is not a question. I'm Sarah from the IAWG, If anybody wants copies of these PowerPoint presentations, you want to send me an email with SVOD panel in the subject line. I'm at Sarah, SARAH, at i8wg.org, and I will collect the panel point presentations and get them to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So one final question, I guess. We worry about what the impact of these services is going to be. In Europe, 10 years ago, we all spoke about cultural diversity and the need to protect the unique cultural identities of Europe, each of them separate. And we kind of stopped talking about that a while ago, and we started talking instead about the business model of territoriality, that as a producer in Europe, you could produce in 2 or 3 countries and not have to buy or sell rights across other countries. Is our European system of territoriality, our ambition to retain cultural diversity, is it threatened in any way by the arrival of services which operate automatically across borders? Does streaming video on demand somehow go in the direction that the European Commission has been talking to us about for ages, of a single digital market in Europe, which challenges cultural diversity, which challenges the way that the market operates at the moment? Or is it still the case that it's such a small percentage of the total audiovisual that it's going to have an impact but not break the system? Will it break the European system?
I don't know what will be the agenda of the next Commission and the next European Parliament, because this one was really involved in the transformation of the European market, in fact. But is the future Commission would be in the same state of mind? I don't really know, but I'm sure of something which would be very important is also the collaboration between European service and almost the European broadcasters service. I think that can be a real alternative and a real development for European creation.
Thank you so much, everybody. I think it's lunch now, isn't it? Which sounds great. And thank you. Thank you to our speakers, to Ellen, to Christian, and to Guillaume. Thank you so much.